Fantastic. Good morning. Good to see everyone out there. Today we are going to be looking at an objection to talking about morality, and we talked about moral realism and moral anti-realism. And one of the views that we talked about, or two of the views that we talked about, moral relativism and cultural relativism, which are related views but are ultimately very different. And so we're going to be talking about those today because these are very popular views, but they also are problematic in a way. Each view is problematic in its own way. And so we want to spend a little bit of time talking about the implications of both ethical relativism and cultural relativism. And welcome to you, Elaine. Good to see you. Fantastic. All right. Happy Thursday. So again, when we're talking about ethics and morality, and I do use those terms interchangeably, although that is somewhat controversial, I suppose. I did explain my reasons for that. We're talking about ethics or morality. We're talking about obligations to others based on valuations of right and wrong. How do we ascertain those valuations of right and wrong? Where do they come from? Are there actual objective standards in the world that we can point to justify these claims, these value claims, these normative claims? Or is it simply a matter of personal subjective opinion? And that's an interesting question. Obviously, if we ask Socrates, the ancient Athenian philosopher, about morality, and let's say we asked him, is murder wrong? He would have claimed that the statement murder is wrong is objectively true because morality exists in the real world. Uh, it is a facet of the world. Moral standards are universal and unchanging, regardless of our personal opinion. And human actions, including murder, should be judged by objective standards that can be applied to everyone. But as the Big Lebowski says in the Coen brothers' famous movie, yeah, well, you know, that's just like your opinion, man. So maybe values are entirely subjective. Maybe it's just a matter of personal opinion. I like something or I don't like something. And the utterances, the statements that we make that purport to be objective value statements are simply declarations of approbation or disapprobation. I like something or I don't like something. It's just a matter of personal preference. And so this brings us, of course, to moral anti-realism. And this is the denial that moral properties or facts can exist objectively in the world. They just don't. And we can deny that moral facts exist at all, or we could maybe accept that they do exist, but they aren't objective in the way that we think about objectivity. There are no objective moral facts. And so moral subjectivism or moral relativism, however you wanted to think about it, and this is this is a very popular view. It's also a view that is often attacked in a very reflexive kind of reactionary way. Uh, Anytime something bad happens in society, often there'll be commentators who say that this is a consequence of moral relativism, as if really the vast majority of people out there conducting their lives are, attuned to moral theory in such a way that, they could articulate, you know, persuasively articulate a view identified as moral relativism. I think that particularly the conservative commentators who blame everything on moral relativism are really, really giving people a lot of credit for, you know, for, for diving into these moral theories and then being able to articulate cogently uh, their view. And I mean, look, people are inconsistent, and when it comes to morality, uh, always have been, and adopt a variety of views strategically when they're not simply making rationalizations for their behavior. When we're legitimately trying to act in a moral way, we will find reasons. And yes, sometimes those reasons align with moral philosophy, but it's pretty rare to, actually meet a person who is disciplined in such a way that they can, this is my view and this is what I always do. And most people are very pragmatic when it comes to moral judgments. And yeah, we can be selectively relative, and we can even identify ourselves as a moral relativist, I suppose. Although it is very hard, like nihilism, it is very hard to do this completely consistently. And so that's a problem when we talk about moral philosophy and ethics in general, is that, it's just like taking a class in economics. You take a class in economics, and what do they talk about? They talk about capitalism, they talk about socialism, but in reality, every economy is a mixed economy. And these are just abstractions. These are just ways that we talk. When we talk about theories, these are ways that we talk about things that are kind of just abstractions, right? And in practice, every economy is a mixed economy. Has to be. So we want to be cautious when we're describing the motivations that the people are complicated and their motivations are complicated, and we don't want to use these theories and these terms to reduce the complexity of human behavior into something that is essentially just a bumper sticker, right? But okay, here's the view of moral relativism. Theory of moral relativism is that morality is subjective. It is a matter of personal opinion. That's it. What is right for me is right for me, and that might not be right for you. Okay. Now, to the extent that this is just actually a coherent moral theory, um, it is somewhat related to the claim of epistemological relativism. And epistemological relativism is the idea that truth is entirely subjective, that truth is a matter of opinion. Now, if we talk about the problems of epistemological relativism, I think that we can see attendant problems in moral relativism. And there are a couple major problems with epistemological relativism. If we say that there is no truth, that statement appears to be self-referentially invalid. It purports to be a statement that describes some state of affairs in the world in a way that is objectively true. The claim that there is no truth purports to be a claim that is objectively true. But if that claim is true, there is at least one truth in the world. Now, this is kind of just a logical problem. There is a more practical problem with epistemological relativism, is that if you try to apply that in your own life, reality imposes certain limitations on your behavior, and those limitations will become apparent very, very quickly. Like, you can genuinely believe that you can fly. Can't. And you can believe that that's your opinion, so it's true. It's truth is whatever you believe. But if you put that belief to the test, reality will catch up with you very quickly. So epistemological relativism is a very kind of problematic claim, isn't it? Well, the problems with moral relativism are not as obvious, but they're still pretty significant, right? If we try to, if we're not using moral relativism just in a strategic way, as most people probably do, we're really trying to live as a moral relativist, this creates certain problems for us. So let's examine this in more detail. So we think about the subjective nature of moral values, which is why the claim of moral relativism arises in the first place, because it just seems like, you know, we're just, when we make moral statements, we're uttering, expressions of approval or disapproval, that we're just, this is like an opinion. So moral statements just appear to be subjective. In the same way that the claim, I like strawberry ice cream. Like, what if I told you that I liked strawberry ice cream? What would you say about that claim? I mean, you'd say that was my opinion. And I may think it's a good opinion. You may hate strawberry ice cream. You may like, butter pecan or something. Not a bad choice. Or pistachio. Also not a bad choice. But again, who cares? That's just my preference. It's just my opinion that strawberry ice cream is the best, right? You may disagree with that. You certainly won't doubt that I hold that opinion. You won't ask me to justify it in any way. You won't ask for evidence. I mean, that's a losing game. I mean, give me evidence why strawberry ice cream is the best. I'm just going to tell you I like it more than any other ice cream, and the conversation ends. Now, there's a game that aficionados play, like this band is the best band, and for the following reasons. Or this film, and I play this too. I play this game too. I mean, I like film, I like music, and so I'll get into these arguments about why band A is better than band B, or why film X is better than film Y, or this show is better than that show. But those conversations come down to positing some type of criteria. And we can generally, if we can agree on the criteria, we have the basis for argument, right? The script was more developed in this movie than that movie. The characters were more plausible, and the stakes or motivations were greater, but we're going to posit some kind of criteria by which we can compare like things. And that's fine. If we can't agree on the criteria, however, there's no basis for conversation. And ultimately, if I just come down and say, well, I really, really just like this, and I don't like that, there's not much that you can do, even if you disagree with me. How about this, though? How about if I said, I like to kill people for sport? Now, that really seems like the first statement, doesn't it? I just like to do this. It's fun. And I mean, Grammatically, it's a similar kind of statement. It's still about preferences. It's still about things I like to do. And the moral relativist will point this out. That ultimately it comes down to I just like to do this. And you can disagree, but your disagreement is just based on the fact that you don't like it. And I mean, I guess that's true. But the question comes up, why don't you like it? And that is not a question that comes up in relation to strawberry ice cream. Nobody cares why you don't like strawberry ice cream. You might not even know. Just don't like it. But when I say that I like to kill people for sport, I'm like, there's going to be like practically, okay, just as a practical matter of living in society. Not everybody will allow me to chop them into pieces with a machete. Strange, isn't it? If it's just my like opinion, man. So unfair. So unfair. Because as similar as these statements sound, and they do sound very similar, statement two does appear to be subjective, but it does stand in need of some justification. Why? Because in practice, people will push back against it. Why? Because unlike statement one, statement two involves the interest and well-being of, and this is just a practical consideration. Practically, if I say, I'm going to hack you into pieces with a machete, you will try to stop me and you will use violence if nothing else works. And nobody's getting into a fight over strawberry ice cream. So I would say that's a pretty relevant difference, right? I would go as far as to say that the second statement must have some type of justification. You must have reasons for doing what you're doing, or you shouldn't do it. And that's the difference, right? If my behavior harms others or has the potential to harm others, I better have good reasons for doing what I'm doing. And these reasons have to be rational and have to be impartial. Why? Because other people have to understand those reasons and, in principle, assent to them, or I'm a bad person. No way around that, right? And there's a logic to this. I might ask this of you. I might come up to you and say, you know what? I'd appreciate it if you did not hack me to pieces with a machete. I may ask that of you. It's possible. Like as I'm going around, doing my business and conducting myself, and I see you standing there with a machete, I may say, hey, 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 don't cut off my arm. It's possible that I might say that, right? If I see you walking around with machete, you're like, gonna chop some people up. I may say to you, please don't hack my limbs off. I don't want you to do that. That's at least plausible, right? I might do that. I might say that. So the moment I say that to you, though, implicitly, I'm promulgating a moral rule, right? Because I have to see immediately the logic of this. If I don't want to be hacked to pieces by somebody wielding a machete, I have to implicitly recognize that rule of not hacking people to pieces with a machete applies to me as well. Like it just is not going to work if I say something like this. I don't want you to cut my arms and legs off, but I can cut your arms and legs off. That's not going to work. That's not going to work. So there's a rule, isn't there? The moment I ask you to refrain from harming me, implicitly, I acknowledge that there is a rule of not engaging in harmful behavior, and I have to follow that rule too. What do we call that? Call that morality. It's not subjective. That's not just a matter of opinion. That's a universal system of moral rules. Now, it's not like it's not magical, it's not supernatural. So yeah, I mean that's true. But there's no legitimate reason if I ask you to refrain from harming me, there's no legitimate reason that I could come up with that the rule doesn't apply to me as well. Why? Because I'm not special. Like I'm not unique. We're all in the same situation. I mean, I can say that I'm special. I can say I'm unique, but can I convince you of that? If I can't, then I'm not really special. So the rule applies to me too. That's pretty objective. Now, I don't know if you want to call that moral realism, honestly, but it's not relativism because relativism isn't going to work in this situation. So if there are no compelling reasons for treating people differently, you shouldn't do it. If I don't want to be singled out, if I don't want to be treated differently, hey, it follows. There's a rule. There's a rule about conduct. I have to follow that rule as well. Why? I'm not special. What about, though, cultural relativism? And cultural relativism, although it is a form of relativism, is different from ethical relativism. Because here, there is a moral norm, and it's not rooted in subjective opinion. It is, however, rooted in culture. Norms are cultural. And it just happens that there's no objective way to compare and decide between different cultural norms. But there are rules. But these rules are connected to cultural frameworks of value judgments, right? So to illustrate this point, Rachel's begins with a story from Herodotus. Herodotus, the Greek writer, right? And he's an amazing writer, and he tells amazing stories. He is often referred to as the first historian, but his quote unquote histories are filled with mythology and stories that probably are apocryphal. But here we get this wonderful story about Darius, the Persian king. Now, unlike Greece, and Greece is always like a hodgepodge of different city states, and it's always in chaos. There is always some kind of chaos there and political, upheaval. The Persian Empire was fairly static and stable, as such empires usually are. And the Persian Empire is mind-bogglingly huge for Herodotus because it stretches all the way from the Greek Ionian Islands on the coast of Asia Minor, all the way across Asia Minor into what today we would identify as the subcontinent of India. Big. And it's all ruled by the Persian king, Darius. And Darius is a very, smart guy. And he's interested because he's king. He has to be, he rules a great many different cultures. I mean, it's all part of the Persian Empire, but the citizens of the Persian Empire come from diverse backgrounds. And you'll find this in any empire. These empires are not homogenous. They can't be, right? The populations are heterogeneous. The cultures are heterogeneous. And any great empire, Roman Empire, all these empires, they're not ethically homogeneous. They can't be, right? So one day, according to Herodotus, Darius brings some Greeks who are from the western part of his empire, and he brings some members of the Calatia, the Calatians, and these people are from what we would now refer to as India. And he asked them about what happens when people die, and they have various stories about what happens when people die. But he said, no, what do you do with the bodies? What happens to the bodies? And they have very different answers. And the Greeks say they burn the bodies. And the Calatii say, no, we eat our dead, as any civilized person would. And so Darius, having kind of a sense of humor, I suppose, he asked the Greeks, how much could I pay you to eat your dead? And the Greeks are horrified by this idea and said, we no amount of money because this is just barbaric. And he looks at Galatians and says, how much money could I get you to burn your dead? And they're horrified. They're like, we cannot, no. And of course, the idea here for Darius is that there is no universal standard of right and wrong, that everything is relative to culture. And this is the argument for cultural relativism. Now, we talk about culture. What exactly do we mean? Culture is the characteristics and knowledge of a particular group of people, right? Language, religion, cuisine, social habits, music, arts. Now, as it turns out, there aren't rigid boundaries between cultures, and we know this, right? But there's shared patterns of behaviors and interactions, cognitive constructs and understandings that are learned through socialization. And the Greeks and the Galatians here have different cultures, and so they have different values. And what Herodotus is saying and what Darius is saying is that values are derivative from cultural norms. It's culture that creates values. Like, we don't create our own values. We're raised in a culture, and those values are inculcated within us by culturalization, by socialization, right? Now, Rachel's has a more contemporary example, although it's not a contemporary, a more modern example. And he looks to Inuit culture, Native American culture in the early 20th century. And specifically the first peoples, the peoples referred to in Canada as the first peoples, the indigenous native tribes in Alaska, northern Canada, and northeastern Siberia, this Arctic circle. And the indigenous Inuits, these various nations who flourished, well, not flourished, it was very difficult to survive in such conditions, but they who lived in this area, they practiced infanticide and senicide. Sometimes they would expose infants to die and the elderly. They would expose them to the elements and they would die. And so this is often pointed to as an illustration of cultural difference. Like, we would not do this in 21st century North America. We don't do this kind of thing. So why would they do this? And Rachel says that people will often point to this and say, well, they have different cultural values. They have different cultural norms. And so what appears right to us is simply a matter of enculturation. If you were an Inuit, you would say, yeah, this is right for us. Just like the Greeks and the Galatians, the Galatii. So here's the argument for cultural relativism. Different societies have different moral codes. They just do. The moral code of a society will determine what is right and wrong within that society. There is no objective standard that can be used to judge one society's code to be better than another. There just isn't. There are just different cultures, different societies. There's no way to judge between them because there's no culture that exists above them. And so these cultural norms are absolute within a particular culture. There's no other way to judge behavior, right? There is no external authority. So the moral code of our own culture is not special. We can't put it above the moral codes of any other society. We can't, it doesn't make, like, we're not special. Just like we made the argument in cultural relativism, there's nothing special about me. I'm just like everyone else. Where our culture is not special. It's just like every other culture. What's the conclusion? Morality is relative to culture. There are no objective intercultural standards by which we can judge one culture to be better than another. Can't. Now, Rachel's is going to point out many problems associated with this view. However, there are some good things about cultural relativism, and he acknowledges this. Rachel's believes that we can learn some important things from cultural relativism. Cultural relativism begins with a sound insight that many practices are mere cultural products. Think about sexual choices or behaviors or gender roles or monogamy versus polyamory. That these are just cultural products, right? And maybe we shouldn't be so judgmental about people who choose to do things or organize their life in a way that's different from ours. It's just different. It's not worse. Can also be dangerous to assume that all of our values are based on some universal absolute standard. It can be arrogant, in fact, to judge another cultural practice, particularly when we don't understand, and chances are that we don't even understand what we're looking at. Rachel points out that what is wrong can often be contextual, uses the example of lying, and toleration can be a positive value, particularly when you contrast toleration with traditional moral absolutism. And traditional moral absolutism is the view that moral truths are fixed and absolute. There is an objective universal standard of right and wrong that applies to everyone at all times and in all places, regardless of culture or historical context. And those who violate this standard are wrong. The problem is that these standards are almost always rooted in a particular cultural perspective. And so what Rachel's would say is that moral absolutism is usually just saying, yeah, my culture is better than yours, and our values are better than your values. And if you don't hold our values, then you're just wrong. And think about the history of colonial imperialism, and not just Western imperialism, but think about the expansion of every empire, and the cultural imperialism that is always a part of that, and the displacement of indigenous values. And you begin to think, hey, wait a minute, there's a pattern here, and it's an ugly pattern, right? Transcendental morality is also conceived as a kind of moral absolutism. The idea that there's a non-material world that cannot be perceived by the senses and is not subject to physical law, and from this world emanates a set of beliefs or rules established by God. But again, this view has been used has been used to oppress and destroy cultural values, right? The justification that, yes, our views are not just a product of our cultural historical context, but in fact are transcendental and absolute. And if you don't believe in our views, you're wrong. So Rachel says, man, it'd be great if we could avoid that too. So Rachel says, look, is there some way that we could reject both extreme relativism and extreme absolutism? Is a third way possible? And that's what his essay is about, really. So he begins with a very disturbing example of Feusia Kasinga. And she was a native of Togo. And at 19, she escaped Togo and made her way to the United States. Why would she do that? Because in Togo, they practice female circumcision. We refer to this as genital mutilation. And in some cases, it is the excision of the clitoris and the external female genitalia, sometimes done by a doctor, sometimes just done by a tribal shaman. It is not specific to any religion or any particular culture, but it is widely practiced in North Africa. And it is justified in some ways, in some cultures, by saying that this is an essential rite of passage for women, and that if women feel sexual pleasure, that they will be more likely to be promiscuous, and this will destabilize the family, and so that this is a practice that is necessary for the stability of the family unit. Now, Miss Kasinga made it to the United States and petitioned for asylum. And the justification for her asylum petition was that she was fleeing gender persecution and gender motivated violence. And this put the United States in a difficult position, because the government of Togo wanted the United States to force Miss Kasinga to return. And many people in the United States said, no, if she returns, they will force her to undergo this horrific mutilating practice. And she doesn't want this. But the government of Togo said, look, this is a cultural practice. You are in no position to judge us and what we do. This is a tradition. We think that this is necessary. And the moral relativists would have to agree. There is no single universal perspective such that we can say that this is wrong. If this is how they do things in Togo, then this is how they do things in Togo. End of story. We aren't in a position to judge the morality of another cultural practice because moral norms are internal to society. Societies generate moral norms. And what we think is right and wrong is simply a manifestation of our own cultural practices. And we're inculcated with these, like bodily autonomy. We think that's a good thing. But why? We think bodily autonomy is a good thing because in the West, the individual is all that matters. That's not an objective moral truth. In other cultures, it's the community that is more important than the individual. But again, that is a matter of cultural perspective. So, should we send this young woman back to Togo so she could be mutilated? It's a very difficult question, isn't it? It's a very difficult question, right? Now, how does Rachel's respond to this? Rachel says, look, is it true that all ethical judgments are simply manifestations of cultural norms? And Rachel's disagrees with that. He says they can be, I mean, reflexively, I mean, we grow up in a culture and we grow up with a certain set of values, but like how many of us still have the values that, that we grew up with? Maybe some people do, but over time you hear about, I mean, just as a practical matter, I mean, you think about these things and you come to your own conclusions. And in a heterogeneous culture like our own, you are able to compare and contrast different value systems. And morality evolves. And what we think is right and what we think is wrong evolves and improves. So maybe we could come up with a kind of, I mean, doesn't necessarily have to be rooted in some kind of metaphysical proposition, but like a practical way, like a practical criteria that we could assert that would allow us to adjudicate conflicts between cultures, right? And so this is what Rachel's does. And he says, look, who does this practice benefit? The Togo in Togo, they say it benefits everyone because the family unit is protected. Women don't behave promiscuously, and there's more social stability. So, is this a practice that actually does it actually benefit society objectively, or does it simply a pretext for oppression and exploitation? Does it simply allow men to control the sexual choices of women? And Rachel says if we look at this objectively, it doesn't seem to be a practice that benefits everyone. It seems to be a practice that benefits only men. And so it seems to be more of a pretext for oppression and exploitation than anything else. Now, okay, why isn't that just a value judgment? Because Rachel says we have to apply the same standard to our own behavior. And we can and we should. So our own cultural norms are not immune to such analysis. And if our own cultural norms don't stand up to this type of interrogation, we should abandon them. right? And I mean, there are practices in our own society that are probably pretty questionable, like male circumcision. Why do we do it? Why do we allow it? And I don't have an answer to that, and I'm not trying to start an argument over it, but it is an interesting phenomena, and we may want to ask ourselves, why do we do it? And if there's not a justification that's compelling, because there is a certain degree of coercion, we shouldn't do it. Now, Rachel's wants to go further here in examining this idea of cultural relativism. And he wants to go to the heart of cultural relativism. And the heart of cultural relativism is the idea that cultures have radically different values. Is that true? Rachel says it's actually not true. And in fact, there are values that all cultures share. And what seems to be cultural difference upon analysis probably isn't as great as we think it is. And so what does he mean by that? Rachel says, look, some values must be shared by all cultures. And again, we get back to morality as cooperation. What would happen if a culture did not protect its young? Okay, Brandon, let's address that. I like that. What would happen if a culture did not protect its young? I mean, logically, would that culture be able to sustain itself? No. I mean, if every time you had a baby, you just tossed it off a cliff or let it fend for itself, that you have to figure out some way to keep your infants alive. You do. What would happen if you didn't prohibit lying? What would happen if you didn't prohibit murder? Think about that for a moment. Like you just, anytime you had the impulse, you could just kill someone. That's not going to be a successful culture, is it? So there are rules that are necessary for any society to exist. Now, Brandon makes an interesting point here. And we see this even within our own culture, don't we, Brandon? People disagree about facts. Now, I grew up in a time where that was not really that true, but it certainly is true today. People live in completely different bubbles, factual bubbles. And if you don't believe in the same facts, there's a problem, right? I mean, we used to have disagreements about policy. You know, I would argue for policy X, someone else would argue for policy Y. Now we disagree about facts. Is the earth round? So, yeah, okay. What happens when other cultures disagree about the facts? Well, look, here's the thing, Brandon, and maybe you disagree with this. Factual claims can be settled scientifically. I mean, you may say, but well, yeah, but some communities won't accept science. Well, then that's their problem. That's what I would say. That's their problem. And it is a problem. It's not just that they have a legitimate belief that science doesn't work. No, it's not good enough. So yeah, there are facts, and factual claims can be settled. And so then once we agree on the facts, Esmeralda says, I look at early religious practices about death, and they all share the same aspects surrounding respecting the dead, no matter the funeral practices. Yeah, you have to do something about the dead, right? And most cultures do have some conception of an afterlife. And there's a sense of respect and care shared by all cultures. That's true. And how the dead are treated, right, in relation to the living. And we do different things, but at the core belief, very similar. Yeah. And in the early 1990s, Siegelman and Peterson, this value study is really, it's well demonstrated that there are certain virtues, right? There are certain cultural behaviors that are seen to be universally good. Wisdom, courage, humanity, transcendence, justice, moderation. Uh, and so, yeah, look, environmental circumstances are different, and in these these values are often manifested in different ways. And cultures can be constructed around different orientations. You can have cultures that are more about community, you can have cultures that are more about individualism, but in all of these cultures, both individualism and community are valuable, right? So there's not as much cultural difference as it seems. Now let's get back to the Inuits. Why did the Inuits commit infanticide and centicide? Rachel says, well, think about it. It's not because they weren't protective of children or they didn't care about infants and old people. It's because their environmental situation was radically different from our own. And I would go as far as to argue if we were in the same environmental circumstance where not everybody could live. Look, the Inuits didn't farm. They didn't have agriculture. They were dependent on hunting and fishing. And that's not guaranteed. And so if you don't have enough calories to sustain the community and the community is facing destruction, you have to make hard choices. We don't have to make those choices. I would argue that if we were in the same situation, we probably would do something very similar. So there's not as much cultural difference as you think. All right. Finally, Rachel says there are some consequences to adopting cultural relativism as a belief system. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that cultural relativism is wrong. It just means that if you accept it, there are some unseemly conclusions that follow. Like what? We could no longer say that that other societies were wrong. Like imagine a society that was just ruthlessly aggressive with its neighbors and enslaved them or committed genocide. Yeah, we could say that's wrong. We can't. Slavery is wrong. Genocide is wrong. Unprovoked aggression is wrong. The cultural relativist says, no, you're just imposing your cultural norms on other people, and you shouldn't do that. Or there's no way to do that. If cultural relativism were true, then we could determine right and wrong simply by looking at our own cultural norms at any time. But think about this. There was racial segregation in the United States. There was slavery in the United States. So the cultural relativist would say, if this was 1850, the cultural relativist would say, well, slavery is accepted here, so it's okay. That doesn't seem right. If cultural relativism were true, then moral progress would be impossible. Was it really better for women not to vote or to hold office or to be treated with diminished legal status? Was that really a better way to do things? Haven't we made progress? Some people would argue no. You could not judge your own society either, as long as there's a novel tradition that you can't make judgments about your own society. That seems wrong. Finally, and again, this is not an argument that cultural relativism is wrong. It's just a consequence of believing cultural relativism. There's no basis for international human rights. Now, think about this claim, and this may be this is a controversial claim, that no matter who you are or no matter where you are on the globe, you have basic fundamental rights, like the right to life, the right not to be enslaved, the right to bodily autonomy. If you believe that, you believe that there's some basis for international human rights. And this view is incompatible with cultural relativism. Again, that doesn't make cultural relativism wrong, but it is incompatible with the idea that all people have have some basic status, moral status. Rachel's leaves us with what he calls the minimum conception of morality. Morality is, at the very least, the effort to guide one's conduct by reason. That is, to do what there are the best reasons for doing. We may not know, but we should try, while giving equal weight to the interest of each individual affected by one's decision. And again, it comes back to this. If our actions have the potential to harm another person, we should really think about why we're doing it. And if there aren't compelling reasons, well, we shouldn't do it. Fantastic. Okay. Fantastic, guys. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Truly, thank you so much. I really appreciate you guys being here. And I'll post this. But thank you. It makes your comments are appreciated, and it just makes the lecture so much better. And very, very thoughtful. You guys, such good Esmeralda, Brandon, great comments. Thank you so much. And I will see you.